Today we're going to discuss two clinical constructs which are related to borderline personality disorder but are not the same. The first one is borderline pattern, first described in the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, published in 2022. And the second construct is the borderline personality organization, first proposed by who else? Otto Kernberg in 1967. The pattern and the organization are not the disorder. Stay tuned, the distinctions are fascinating. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology in various sundry universities. Okay, let's start with a fact. There is no diagnosis of borderline personality disorder in the ICD-11. None. There is no substitute for such diagnosis. There's no borderline personality disorder by another name. None. Self-styled experts who tell you otherwise have no idea what they're talking about. Instead, the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, introduced a new construct, the borderline pattern. And I would like to read to you what it says. But before I go there, borderline pattern can be diagnosed together with highly specific trait domains and highly specific dysfunctions. As you may recall from my previous videos, the ICD is not like the DSM, whereas the DSM provides essentially a list of bullet points called diagnostic criteria. The ICD is much more fluid and allows the clinician, allows the therapist and the psychiatrist and the psychologist, allows them to construct a composite picture using a variety of trait domains, a variety of dysfunctions, clinical ratings, and so on and so forth. The clinical picture emanating from the ICD is much closer to reality, much more factual. And so a clinician may assign certain trait domains to a client upon presentation, then analyze the client's various dysfunctions, rate the client clinically, and add onto all this the borderline pattern specifier. And here is what the borderline pattern specifier in the ICD-11 has to say. I'm quoting, "The borderline pattern specifier may be applied to individuals whose pattern of personality disturbance is characterized by a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affects, and by marked impulsivity, as indicated by 5 or more of the following. Number 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Number 2, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, which may be characterized by vacillations between idealization and evaluation, typically associated with both strong desire for and fear of closeness and intimacy. Number 3, identity disturbance manifested in markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self, known as self-concept. Number 4, a tendency to act rashly, recklessly, in states of high negative affect, leading to potentially self-damaging behaviors, for example, risky sexual behaviors, reckless driving, excessive alcohol or substance use, and binge eating. Number 5, recurrent episodes of self-harm, example, suicide attempts or gestures, self-mutilation. Number 6, emotional instability due to marked reactivity of mood. Fluctuations of mood may be triggered either internally, by one's own thoughts, for example, or by external events. As a consequence, the individual experiences intense dysphoric mood states, which typically last for a few hours, but may last for up to several days. Next, chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, manifested in frequent displays of temper, yelling or screaming, throwing or breaking things, getting into physical fights, and so on. And finally, transient dissociative symptoms or psychotic-like features, brief hallucinations, paranoia in situations of high affective arousal. The borderline pattern specifier continues to say, other manifestations of a borderline pattern, not all of which may be present in a given individual at a given time, include the following: a view of the self as inadequate, bad, guilty, disgusting, and contemptible. An experience of the self as profoundly different and isolated from other people. A painful sense of alienation and pervasive loneliness. Proneness to rejection, hypersensitivity. Problems in establishing and maintaining consistent and appropriate levels of trust in interpersonal relationships. Frequent misinterpretation of social signals. So this is the foundation of the clinical assessment of a borderline pattern in patients which otherwise possess traits unrelated to borderline. So you could present, for example, you could enter therapy as a client, and the clinician would notice that you have negative affect, you are dissocial, you are antagonistic, you are anankastic, you have obsessive compulsive features and so on, but at the same time, you have a borderline pattern. So the clinical interviewing may lead to a kind of compounded diagnosis without labeling. There's no label there, but capturing the essence of what's going on in the client's mind, the client's psyche, client's emotions, client's cognitions. The ICD-based assessment is very versatile, very flexible, and very factual. And I like it a lot, much more than the DSM-based questionnaires and so on and so forth. Today, we diagnose borderline personality disorder using the what we call the ZAN BPD, ZAN BPD, which was first proposed by Zaccarini and others in 2006. Some clinicians are still using Gunderson's work, the DIB, the diagnostic interview for borderline patients, but it's going out of fashion. Today, the ZAN BPD is mostly used, and the rating of ZAN BPD is a threshold for diagnosing borderline patterns or even borderline personality disorder under the DSM. The ZAN BPD assesses borderline personality disorder, but can be applied to the identification and delineation and description of the borderline pattern specifier under the ICD, because the ZAN BPD is very flexible. The elements in the ZAN BPD, this test proposed by Zaccarini in 2006, the elements include the assessment of anger, especially specific or different content areas, frustration, irritability, intense anger, mildly angry acts, intense angry acts of verbal nature, intense angry acts of a physical nature, and so on. So there's a lot of attention paid to anger, aggression, internalized or externalized. Number two, the assessment of affective instability, volatility, lability, including, again, different content areas, somewhat or substantially out of proportion relative to the severity of life circumstances and triggers, and other parameters, other delineators. There's also an assessment of chronic feelings of emptiness, and again, it's divided to different content areas. And there's an assessment of serious identity disturbance, including different content areas such as mild identity disturbances, serious identity disturbances, and so on. So the ZAN BPD captures the quiddity, the very core, the very essence, fluctuating essence, unstable essence of borderline. Other emphasis in the ZAN BPD, to remind you, it's a test for borderline personality disorder that is currently the dominant test. Other elements include the assessment of stress-related paranoid ideation or dissociative symptoms, And again, it's divided to different content areas: mild feelings of distrust, unreality, sense of unreality, intense feeling of distrust or unreality, depersonalization, derealization, and so on. There's an assessment of frantic efforts to avoid the feeling of being abandoned or being rejected, and overt or covert efforts to manage these fears. There's an assessment of self-destructive behaviors, including suicide threats, suicide gestures and suicide attempts, different types of self-mutilation, scratching, punching oneself, cutting, burning. And these are all divided into minor or more serious and severe. There is an assessment of impulsive behaviors, which is divided to 12 content areas. It's a very powerful test. And then there's an assessment of a pattern of unstable and intense personal relationships, areas that alternate between idealization and devaluation, dependency, fleeing from intimacy, engulfment anxiety, and having stormy relationships marked by arguments and breakups. So a clinician under the ICD is perfectly authorized, should feel comfortable to use the ZAN BPD test. Albeit the ZAN BPD is associated mainly with the DSM, it's still very good at spotting and ferreting out borderline patterns. Now, the problem with borderline, any type of borderline personality organization, borderline pattern, borderline personality disorder, the problem with all these borderline aspects of the personality is that borderline is often comorbid. It's often diagnosed with other mental health issues. And these other mental health issues obfuscate and cloud the picture. They contaminate, if you wish, the purity, the unadulterated nature of the borderline construct. And they raise multiple major issues. The ICD provides differential diagnosis in a variety of areas, and we will discuss them in a minute. And they're all attendant upon, they're all extensions of the borderline pattern in the ICD. Now, the ICD mentions the issue of comorbidity or co-occurrence in the borderline pattern, and it touches on a wide range of symptoms. What is called internalizing features: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder; externalizing features: substance abuse, suicidal behaviors, self-harm, self-mutilation, eating disorders, attention deficits; and interpersonal features, which is the domain of what the DSM calls personality disorders. Personality disorders in the DSM, especially cluster B, they are relational. They have to do with interpersonal relationships. But in borderline, there's also a co-occurrence, comorbidity of psychotic features, transient hallucinations, extreme dissociation, paranoid trends. Dissociation, when I say dissociation, I mean insomnia, derealization, depersonalization. So there is a huge overlap. The overlap is extremely unusual. And when the patients present, they can be misdiagnosed with a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder or a substance use disorder or impulsive disorder or even psychosis, when actually the problem is borderline features, a borderline pattern, or a borderline personality organization. There have been attempts actually to redefine borderline personality disorder as a mood disorder, or as a mode of emotion dysregulation, or as an impulsive disorder, or as an interpersonal disorder, or as a complex trauma disorder, post-traumatic disorder. And for those of you who want to see a review of all these attempts, please see the work of Paris, P-A-R-I-S, especially the articles he published in 2020. She published in 2020. So there are major issues with the coherence and validity of the borderline construct. I'm not denying this. But it seems that the same problem exists with other mental health disorders. And we have to balance between lack of clarity, doubts, comorbidities and co-occurrences on the one hand, and on the other hand, how useful the construct is. Does it allow us to identify the patient, to profile the patient in a way which recommends itself to highly efficacious treatments? If the answer is yes, then we would rather keep the psychopathological construct, even if it's a bit fuzzy. And this is exactly what the ICD committee and the DSM committee have decided to do. Let's start with a few of the co-occurrences and comorbidities. Depression is the number one. Depressive symptoms are actually the main reason why borderline patients seek treatments or present themselves. There are studies that show that all borderline patients at one time or another suffered from depressive disorders or depressive episodes or depressive symptoms. All. There's no exception. And the crucial issue when we discuss the comorbidity of depression and BPD or borderline pattern in the ICD, the crucial issue is, of course, stability versus instability. Borderline patients describe an unstable mood that is highly sensitive to interpersonal conflict, real or anticipated, and also reactive to stress. Stressors generate anxiety and depression in borderline patients much more than in the general population or in patients with other issues. And so this is what we call emotion dysregulation. And it's probably a trait, so it's likely hereditary, genetic. There's work by Linehan as early as 1993 alluding to this. And so this problem with regulating emotions explains why so many patients are chronically suicidal and even when they're not depressed. Whereas a depressive person, pure depression, may possess suicidal ideation during the depressive episode. Borderline, this is basically background noise. It's constantly there. It emerges all the time. I will not go into it right now, but this is one comorbidity. A very problematic comorbidity or a very problematic differential diagnosis is between borderline and bipolar. In many countries, clinicians, mental health practitioners, and scholars make the egregious mistake of conflating the two. Recently, I've been to Austria, and people there, scholars, clinicians, told me that BPD is bipolar, which is rookie mistake. It's mind-boggling, the level of ignorance that would motivate one to make such a statement. Emotion dysregulation is the feature that distinguishes BPD from bipolar. In BPD, mood vacillations are frequent, but they are short-lived. The mood swings are short-lived. In bipolar, the hypomanic episodes can last days or even weeks. BPD can develop psychosis lasting as long as a few days, and these episodes are usually misidentified as mania. But again, the medications used for bipolar disorders are totally ineffective in borderline. We tried for decades. They don't work. So this shows that the confusion between these conditions is seriously deleterious, seriously damaging to the patient. There were even scholars who suggested the bipolar spectrum, where the mild cases are diagnosed in the absence of manic or hypomanic episodes. And this bipolar spectrum was immediately totally mixed with borderline. It's a mess. It's a complete mess. Borderline is borderline. Bipolar is bipolar. They have nothing to do with each other. One is a mood disorder, one is a personality disorder, a personality pattern. One is a mood disorder. Biochemical background, everything is completely different. What about complex trauma or even post-traumatic stress disorder. About 25% up to 30% of people diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder, these patients also experience post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, not CPTSD, PTSD. This comorbidity has to do with childhood maltreatment, for example, incest, sexual abuse, or worse. So, trauma is not in the etiology of borderline personality disorder. Trauma is not the main cause of borderline personality disorder. Various meta-analyses of studies, Porter, for example, did quite a lot of work. They suggest that emotional neglect, invalidation, is the most important environmental risk factor for the disorder, not abuse, not trauma. On the very contrary, being ignored, being neglected. What about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? It's a disorder that also starts in childhood, very similar to borderline, and continues into adult life, very similar to borderline. But BPD usually starts in adolescence, shortly after puberty, while ADHD starts earlier. Some BPD patients, of course, can be diagnosed with ADHD, but ADHD is overdiagnosed and is threatening to replace legitimate diagnosis. It is metastasizing. Especially when childhood onset cannot be confirmed, it's probably not ADHD. When the whole set of symptoms, the symptomatology started in adolescence, it's probably borderline. So there's a huge confusion regarding the possible causes of attention problems with a specific diagnosis reserved for medical conditions, stimulants, and you name it. So it's a sprawling field, and it seems that ADHD is consuming erstwhile diagnoses which have nothing to do with ADHD. BPD is as rare as NPD. The community prevalence of BPD is about 2%, but 10% or 9% of the clinical population, of all people presenting for treatment, 9 to 10% are actually BPDs, borderlines. So that gives the wrong impression that borderline is much more prevalent than it is. Similarly, in narcissism, about 1.7% of the general population suffer from NPD, and they present in therapy only following a collapse or mortification and so on. So this gives the wrong impression that most narcissists are either covert or that the prevalence is much higher. To this very day, the perception is that most patients with BPD are women, but recent studies, especially community studies, show that there are many, many men with BPD who are undiagnosed and untreated. It's probably because women seek help for BPD much more than men. It's safe to say that half of all borderlines are men and half of all narcissists are women. What about genetics? Whereas in pathological narcissism, we do not have a convincing, rigorous body of studies that proves that pathological narcissism is genetic. That's not the case with borderline. Behavioral genetic studies using community samples of twins have found that nearly half of the variance in BPD is heritable, is related to genetics. So they are not genetic markers for BPD, or actually for any other diagnosis in psychiatry, believe it or not. This myth online, propagated and perpetuated by charlatans, that the mental health disorders are hereditary or genetic. We don't have a single genetic marker, for any psychiatric disorder. Yes, this includes schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, let alone narcissistic personality disorder and so on. It's several studies have shown that if BPD is genetically determined, probably it would involve hundreds or thousands of interacting genes, and all these genes put together account for less than 5% of the variance in borderline. So there's a heritability gap. There are many interactive pathways leading towards disorder, and no, they are not genetically determined. Most, but not all, people with the borderline pattern have been exposed to environmental adversity in childhood, adverse childhood experiences, or trauma or abuse in a variety of ways. Remember, abuse doesn't have to be physical or verbal or psychological. A parent, a mother, a parent who instrumentalizes her child, parentifies the child, overprotects the child, spoils the child, is abusing the child. I've dealt with it in other videos. But most BPD, most patients with borderline personality disorder, if not all of them, have been exposed to environmental adversity in childhood and in adolescence. Trauma is pretty common in the borderline etiology, but it's not the main risk factor. The most frequent kind of trauma is emotional neglect, as I told you, or emotional abuse. There's a high frequency of dysfunctional families in borderline personality. But there are other studies which seem to challenge this. For example, sibling studies. Siblings raised by the same parents, even twins, are rarely concordant for BPD. In other words, they rarely develop BPD simultaneously. There is some gene environment interplay or interaction here. There's a differential sensitivity to the environment. And so probably we need to develop a biosocial theory of borderline. Borderline is also common in developed countries, but less prevalent in less developed countries, in developing countries. Of course, one possible explanation is that traditional cultures offer more resources for emotional support, and they're protective against this form of mental disorders. And of course, in least developed countries, there is no infrastructure to diagnose people. Now, longitudinal studies found that somewhere between 5 and 10% of patients with borderline, it's closer to 10%. Sometimes it's 11% in some studies. These patients eventually die by suicide. Suicide is the leading cause of death in borderline personality disorder under the age of 70. It is notable that almost all these patients had chronic suicidality. And all borderlines, chronically, all the time, contemplate suicide, ideate suicide, consider suicide, even make preparations for suicide and attempt suicide. Yet only 10% die of suicide. The lifespan of patients with borderline is shortened, but it's shortened by poor health. So borderlines live 10 to 20 years fewer years than normal people. It's common in most severe mental health issues, psychotic disorders, for example. Most patients with borderline pattern first develop clinical symptoms during adolescence, and the peak of the psychopathology tends to be in late adolescence and early 20s, and after this stage, the disorder tends to remit or recede gradually, with the vast majority of cases no longer diagnosed by age 35 to 45. No longer diagnosable. Disorder just remits spontaneously, goes away. The prognosis for borderline is actually extremely good, whereas in narcissism, it's actually extremely bad. Okay, that's a picture given to us by the ICD, and I would like to compare it to a construct proposed by Otto Kernberg, the one and only, the father of the field, in 1967. He came up with the idea, or with the construct of borderline personality organization. He suggested there's a level of personality organization which is characterized by instability in identity, volatility of relationships, and affect, lability in affect, and as well as the use of what we call in psychoanalytic literature primitive defense mechanisms, such as splitting. It's a psychoanalytic concept, and it describes the structure of personality functioning that lies between neurotic and psychotic levels. So while borderline personality organization is somehow related to borderline personality disorder, it's not synonymous with it. It represents a broader spectrum of personality functioning, or to be more precise, personality dysfunctioning. The key characteristics of borderline personality organization are very similar to the borderline pattern. And I regret that the ICD didn't bother to credit Otto Kernberg with these insights. The borderline personality organization includes these features: identity diffusion, a lack of stable and integrated sense of self with shifting and contradictory self-perceptions, unstable relationships, intense but yet unstable interpersonal relationships, marked by idealization and devaluation of others. Primitive defenses, immature defense mechanisms such as splitting, viewing people as all good or all bad, projective identification, projecting one's own unacceptable feelings onto others and forcing them to accept this projection, and denial. Impulsivity, difficulty controlling impulses leading to behaviors such as substance abuse, reckless driving, or risky sexual behavior. Emotional or emotion dysregulation, difficulty managing and regulating emotions, often experiencing intense and fluctuating moods. Brief psychotic episodes, micro-episodes. In times of stress, individuals may experience brief periods of distorted reality testing. Fear of abandonment, a pervasive fear of being abandoned or rejected, which can lead to clingy or avoidant behaviors in relationships. Difficulty with reality testing. I want to clarify, people with borderline personality organization are not psychotic, but they may have difficulty to maintain a stable sense of reality, particularly when they are stressed or challenged or rejected or humiliated or abandoned, or engulfed with intimacy. So there's a difference between borderline personality disorder and borderline personality organization. Borderline personality organization is a broad concept, an umbrella concept. It encompasses a range of personality functioning levels and personality dysfunctioning levels, while BPD is a specific clinical diagnosis. BPD is more severe than BPO. The disorder is more extreme, more harsh, more severe than the organization. BPD is characterized by a greater degree of impairment in functioning, a more diagnosable clinical picture, and very conspicuous clinical features. Individuals with the organization may not meet the criteria for the disorder. They display some of the core features associated with it, but not all. It's very reminiscent of Sperry's idea of personality styles. Sperry suggested that there is a borderline personality style. Borderline personality organization represents a level of personality organization characterized by a particular constellation of features and defense mechanisms. It provides a framework for understanding and classifying individuals with varying degrees of personality difficulties, including those who may or may not meet the full criteria for borderline personality disorder. Some literature in the description, and now you're fully acquainted with the ICD's approach to borderline features, the borderline pattern, having eliminated borderline personality disorder and emotional uptake or emotional regulation disorder, having eliminated them in the latest 11th edition. Borderline personality disorder is still a hotly disputed diagnosis. As I said earlier in this video, many scholars are attempting to subsume it under other mental issues or conflate it with other mental issues. But I believe that the borderline pattern or the borderline personality organization is a valid clinical construct which captures the essence of some individuals, the way nothing else can. See if you agree.